Welcome, everyone. We have people from across Canada joining us today, operators, educators, people from associations, people that work in the policy or in governments, and we're all grateful to have you here. Welcome and thank you for joining us. Today's webinar will be recorded and available for download from our website. Included with that will be a copy of this presentation in a PDF form. You're certainly welcome to go and grab it following today's session and use it to help communicate the messages to others on your team. Additional information is also available from our website. I will, from time to time over today's presentation, point you to the direction of some of that information. My name is Philip Mondor. I am President and CEO of Tourism HR Canada. It's an industry organization with a mandate aimed at building a world-leading tourism workforce. Tourism HR Canada facilitates, coordinates, and enables human resource development activities that support a globally competitive and sustainable industry and foster the development of dynamic and resilient workforce. Again, thank you for joining us today. I encourage you to use the chat and web chat functions and the Q&A section as we go along. We have Heather who will be monitoring those questions and will try to keep up with answering any that may come up. But indeed, if there are other questions we cannot answer within the time we have for today's webinar, we'll definitely include the answers as part of our follow-up to today's session. The session is expected to be about 50 minutes to 1 hour. Thank you. So let's get started. First, I want to acknowledge a special acknowledgement to the Government of Canada, for which this webinar would not be possible without their support and funding. This work is part of the TourismRecovery.ca initiative. TourismRecovery.ca was launched by Tourism HR Canada in June to help the sector respond to COVID-19 crisis by providing timely information and practical tools at no cost. We'll learn about the website and the information and tools that are available for free as we move along through this session. Tourism businesses have asked us for webinars to help guide them through some of the big topics on that website. This is one of the TourismRecovery.ca webinars with a focus on strategic planning for business continuity. Now, as we get started, you might want to think about the situation we're currently in. Where were we before COVID? Just what was your focus? What did you offer? What were your challenges? What was going well? Now compare that to where you are today. How has COVID impacted your business? What are you doing to stay alive and possibly even to thrive? Today, we're going to walk through some of these big questions, hopefully give you some examples and tools to work with, and see if we can't come out with some recommendations that will help you manage through these COVID times. To start off with, I'm going to use a few slides to set the context and to give you a brief understanding of the impacts of COVID. These slides I'm about to present are from a larger presentation supplied on September 28th, available on our website. But just to put it in perspective for you. World Health Organization on September 27th had, at that point, it had been 200 days since the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 as a pandemic. By the 200th day mark, there had been 33.3 million cases worldwide, and sadly, just over 1 million deaths. So 200 days, 1 million deaths. And in recent weeks, the resurgence or new spikes are occurring in several countries. Canada, in very recent weeks, has also been one of those examples. As you all know, the US visitor market has been essential to Canada's tourism economy, and it's one of the most hard-hit countries. COVID-19 will be with us for some time to come, and no one is quite sure just how long. The devastation here, the devastation that we're having is unprecedented. Let's just look for a moment at a slide produced by Destination Canada, adapted for this presentation. They refer to the unprecedented collapse. Here, there's a trajectory of 40 years of how the demand on tourism in Canada has been. Just look at these markers for a moment. Adapted from one of Destination Canada's slides, you can see the impacts of relatively recent events, but nothing compares to COVID-19. This data is taken from Statistics Canada's Frontier Counts. Frontier Counts concern the number of international travelers by selected category and by type of transportation, as well as the number of automobiles, trucks, and other vehicles entering Canada. This diagram is a broad and general summary. In the past 4 years, the visitor growth trajectory has also been one of the strongest periods since 1972, which makes the collapse even more acute. To put this in perspective, a brief note about SARS. That was the last example of a coronavirus that is still memorable to many of us. SARS, or severe acute respiratory syndrome, was first diagnosed in, or first talked about by World Health Organization in December of 2003. Globally, there was just over 8,000 probable cases with 774 deaths. Compare that to today's scenario. In Canada, in that window of time, there were 251 probable cases. Most were in Ontario, with 54 deaths. There are a few events in modern history that can rival the immediate impact of the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the US and indeed the world economy. The airline was particularly hard hit because of commercial airlines were the weapon used by terrorists in the attacks of the World Trade Center. But still, look at the scenario we are facing today with COVID-19. Now, these numbers, by the way, are detailed in our PowerPoint deck, and indeed you can also access this information, in this particular case, from Destination Canada. You'll notice on the slides that there's always a reference to where the material came from. One other note before I leave a little bit about the context here on how COVID is playing out. Leger Marketing, which is one of the firms that have been doing a lot of research and tracking on this, also just put out something just a few days ago I thought might be of interest here. When polled, Canadians were asked where they put their priorities towards preventing the spread of the coronavirus or towards preventing the fallout of job losses. Canadians reported 72% preferred that we spent our resources on preventing the spread of coronavirus, with 28% talking about preferred that we've put the resources into preventing the economic fallout and job losses. So you can see the sentiment out there is a concern in the sense that people know that we're in this for the long haul and that we've first got to deal with the coronavirus before we start dealing with some economic issues. Okay, so pre-pandemic, tourism in Canada employed just over 2 million workers. We were using the number 1.8, but we were just about to publish new data. And at that point, it was just over the 2 million mark. It was a growing sector. It had been one of the fastest growing economic sectors in Canada over the last decade. What happened during COVID? Well, in February, when the World Health Organization announced COVID, there was an immediate impact. This slide I've borrowed from a recent webinar we hosted on September 28th called Growth Interrupted, Navigating COVID's Shock to Canada's Tourism Workforce. This webinar and the downloadable PowerPoint is on our website for those that might be interested. It contains the most current information on the labor or workforce data across Canada and the impacts on revenues as a result. This presentation also contains projections moving forward right through to 2025. The information is broken down by province and by sector in other forms. Now, you can see from the slide, this helps show the impact of COVID on the workforce in very stark terms. In February, there was just over 2 million workers, as I mentioned. By April, within 10 weeks, there was a loss of 881,700 workers. These displaced workers were accounting for nearly 1/3 of all Canadians who lost their jobs at that time. By August, we'd managed to gain about 572,000 jobs. Tourism made great efforts to call back or hire new people to fill jobs. This coincided with Government of Canada relief measures, which were very helpful. But still, the restrictions on travel for international visitors, on service options, and more, the sector fell short of its potential. In terms of employment, there were 463,000 fewer workers than the same time last year. And in terms of displaced workers, there was nearly 310,000 that never returned to work. Many who were employed since April have had reduced hours and continue to face uncertainty about their jobs. In some sectors, actual hours worked have returned to pre-COVID levels, but despite increases in April, most sectors are still reporting a total number of hours worked by all employees below levels seen in February and absolutely below levels seen in July of last year. Accommodation and food service workers were hit most hard. It will be, also we know on recovery, and this is from yet different research from McKinsey and Company, that the anticipated recovery times for certain sectors will lag others. And the tourism sector, for the most part, characterized here by two different categories, is expected to be the slowest to recovery. Our data shows the same thing. It will not be until late 24, early 25, before we see numbers like we did in February of this year. So I know you're all feeling this. You're all having a real challenge in the tourism industry with trying to sustain your operations, trying to stay afloat. And summer might have helped, but moving into the fall, things are going to get even more difficult. So what can you do? What can you do as a company to try and redefine your business practices or take on strategies that will enable you to continue to operate? So what are we talking about in terms of strategic planning? Well, let's start with one point to begin. Strategic planning is simply about business survival, but it's more. Let's try something to start. Now, this might be familiar to many of you. It's one of those classic examples you see in different literature, using matchsticks and asking you to solve a problem. Here is an equation of Roman numerals made with 10 matches. But it's confusing, isn't it? It doesn't add up. If you know your Roman numerals, that basically says 11 plus 1 equals 10. That doesn't make sense. But this problem can be solved. If you break away from the obvious way of looking at things, if you look at the situation from a different perspective, you might actually solve the answer or find a solution. Let's think about that. One possibility, looking at it in a different way, is to invert your thinking. If you flip this, it turns out it starts to make sense. 10 is actually equal to 1 plus 9. Now, the point of this little brief introductory exercise is to just get you to think about strategic planning as an exercise where you need to think differently. I'm going to give you one more image to look at, just to help you get out of your conventional way of looking at things. It's called the tail of the cat. There we go. Most people, when they see this, are going to interpret this as reading the cat. However, you'll notice both the H and the A are exactly the same character in the original text. Theoretically, you could have looked at this as reading take it, which of course makes no sense at all. But the point here is in a similar way, you're looking at this and you're realizing there are different ways to look at what's in front of you. Things that you're familiar with looking at around you, in fact, may have an entirely different narrative or possibility. This is a key theme that's going to follow through for the rest of today's presentation, because strategic planning is so much about really thinking differently. Strategic planning is about looking at things differently, identifying the opportunities, learning how to harness them. Oxford Dictionary describes strategy as the skill of planning the movements of armies in a battle or war. Now, it might feel like this at times, but we'll focus on the strategy you need, the way in which your business can plan for the future, plan for change in a trying time. Business environments, after all, must constantly change in response to economic and financial variables, amongst other things. COVID is the most current example. To help you with this, we've assembled tools and information. Let's shift gears and look at some of these tools and start working with them. The first tool I'm going to present here is referred to as the Pestle analysis. This is a framework that many of you would be familiar with. It's one of the frameworks featured on TourismRecovery.ca. Known as Pestle, it is basically the acronym for each element of this environmental scan. I will use this slide to introduce this framework and provide examples for each item along the way. I'm looking at it from the sector or an industry level, but many of the same things I'm going to mention here will probably apply to you at your business or community level. Think about these ideas as you move through this. Think about it in terms of your own business. After this slide, I'll get into specific examples on how this very model can apply to different tourism operations, and we'll use some concrete examples. And while you're thinking about how this applies to your own operations, I encourage you to think about doing this process with your team, that is later. And it's a strong foundational exercise, and it can and should encourage engagement by everyone. Really, the more ideas you can collect for each of these, the stronger your analysis will be. So let's just quickly look at some examples here from an industry level. If I think about it from a political level, we know currently in tourism that there are a number of factors that are contributing to how we can operate or where we may need to think about changes. Things like tax implications. We've seen increased in different types of taxes. Immigration policies have shifted to enable more workers fit for employment in this sector of the so-called low-skilled categories. Industry regulations in this industry have increased substantially in the last decade, subject to all kinds of different programs and services that we offer. If you look at it from an economic lens, we are always impacted by differences in exchange rates. Labor costs are an example that many of you would be familiar with. Over the last 5 or 7 years, they have increased. Consumer spending trends have also changed significantly. We actually have more types of consumers and different types of spending trends. So this speaks to different requirements around target marketing of different populations. We see more affluent visitors, for example, from Asia, but we see more backpackers from other countries. From a social point of view, we all know that the world has become a far more global environment. In other words, there's much more mobility of workers and learners. Workforce, therefore, has changed significantly. Canada does just not have a very high birth rate, so we rely on new Canadians. This has changed what the workforce demographic looks like significantly. Most of our original workforce, is aging, and soon we'll see much more retirement happen and not enough people to fill those jobs. Subsequently, by the way, with travelers moving from different countries to ours and new kinds of travelers, there is very different demographics and consumer interest and demands. Technology, of course, is impacting all of our lives in many different ways. This industry has seen more automation in certain areas. It's also having to respond to disruptive technologies and ensure that its type of operations are facilitating the needs of its consumers. Updating its technology platforms, making sure that it manages data and storage carefully. All issues that 10 years ago were not a concern today actually present a litigious issue. Legal issues have increased, new and changing labor laws. In fact, we're going to see some of the largest changing labor laws and labor legislation over the next several months, driven or impacted, or rather informed by the different scenarios we're facing from COVID. Health and safety regulations, as you're all well aware of, have changed dramatically in the last 8 months, and a need for increased risk management is now becoming the norm. From an environmental point of view, there is much of a push towards more sustainable resources or more corporate social responsibilities and so on. So I'm just using this as an example to give you a bit of a flavor on how one can start to look at the factors that impact your business, things that are not always within your control, but things that you need to be well aware of to help you begin to understand the context in which you're operating. This environmental scan is the basis for helping you make decisions on your strategy. Let's look at this with some a little more concrete sampling to it. For today, what we've done is selected our first example, our first case study of a business called Watering Hole in One. It's a sports bar and eatery. This place is a single unit family run restaurant in a large city. Its market is largely linked to people who attend big games or sporting events because they're right next to one of the large venues that hosts these games. So let's take a look at this for a moment and just give some examples of what they might be thinking about. And again, we're being very selective here. There are many further ideas. From a political point of view, right now, Watering Hole in One's management is probably contemplating a lot about the changes that they have had to face with respect to COVID policies and regulations, much of this with uncertainty. They've had to consider all the impacts on how they operate, their access to supplies, changes in the demographic who they are appealing to. There are new rules in how staff work and how they interact with guests, different considerations because both guests, workers, and indeed suppliers are fearful of COVID, so protocols have changed significantly. Technology has become perhaps more of a concern. There are needs that are associated with technology were not there before. And using technology as a way to drive business lines of business is becoming more important. If you look at it from a legal and regulatory point of view, health and safety has become the largest concern in the last 4 or 5 months in particular. And we're even seeing now increased requirements for compliance. So fines have been introduced. But there are other litigious concerns here. If someone does get sick, what are the liabilities to the company? How does that work? Are you insured? Environmental factors are coming into play. So some of these things that were mentioned here are meant to just prompt ideas to get you thinking. If you're looking at your own context, you're probably imagining some of these very same issues and probably a lot of other ones. Just shifting gears for one more sample, let's take a look at a Mi'kmaq heritage site. This is a different type of tourism business. It'll have some things that perhaps are similar to the one we've just seen, but also have unique differences. This is an indigenous guiding experience in a rural or remote settings. It's seasonal, so it may have different implications. From a political point of view, There are many that of these businesses in rural areas that have in fact greater restrictions on things like travel bans or limitations on what they can do because of lack of health services or means to address outbreaks should they arise. There are more subsidies to support the kinds of issues they are facing to enable these businesses to stay afloat. So government support, policy, and programs have kicked in. From an economic point of view, they are probably struggling more than most and are not able to probably keep their staff in place, or at least in a very limited capacity. So these are just examples again. The types of services that they offer, which is a guiding experience, which effectively is on site, means that they can't do what other businesses have done by trying to provide their services through other means. At least there's more limitations. The stay-at-home trend means that they might try to do things perhaps like maybe video, do video clips of what they're doing or TikTok kinds of sessions or something, but it's not going to replace the full guiding experience or use of an interpreter. So they have constraints on that side. Technology is something that they've always operated with, and indeed it's going to continue to be a similar situation, but now the reliance on it might be more acute. Again, regulatory bans might restrict some of the concerns they have on legal matters. And finally, it's interesting when you think of a lot of Indigenous tourism in particular, where environmental and sustainable practices are core to their business makeup. Again, the land stewardship and travel requirements are probably factored in carefully into how they're going to define how they move forward and what that means. But restrictions on what they have to work with might limit what it is that they can do. So when one is looking at these kinds of Pestle models or environmental scanning models, what you're trying to do is really be creative with your thinking. You're trying to identify what the opportunities are, what the challenges are. Really, it's to provoke thinking, to get you really getting a good context of the things that are impacting your businesses, but perhaps some of the things that might help you think about how you could look at doing things differently. So what? So why do we bother with these kinds of research models? Well, the point is that this is really foundational. This foundational research is at the core of making decisions on how you sustain your business operations. Another way to put it is how you do your strategy. It informs what you do, your products, your services. It provides insights on opportunities. It helps you identify the markets that you might be able to serve. It helps you identify where you might make investments or not on infrastructure things such as technology. It basically helps you also focus your funding towards training. It helps you inform the kinds of people you might need in your operations. Bottom line, it'll help you with unexpected events. It'll help you better prepare and be more nimble to adapt to change. Because in doing this, you're not only identifying your strengths, you're identifying the kinds of shortfalls or weaknesses you may have, but at the same time, that's opening up ideas for opportunities. When you're thinking about this, you can also do a similar exercise, but instead of it being about your company, think about your competition or think about your community. And in so doing, this is going to help you get an understanding of where you fit in the market. Finally, this is something that should be routine. It should be part of your business way of working. This will help you stay nimble and better navigate change over time. Now, we did present Pestle as one idea, but on our website of TourismRecovery.ca, under the tab of strategy, there is a whole section on strategic planning. And indeed, there are many other examples of models that you can consider, for which that we have information and some direction and guidance on how to use them. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly to give you a feel for what they are. It's just another way, another tool in the toolbox, as it were, to get you and your team thinking about getting a perspective on the challenges, but more importantly on what you can do about them. So this one here is referred to as Porter's 5 forces. And the analysis here looks at those 5 dimensions, the competition, and so on. Another example here is a strategic planning model that's referred to as visioning. This is a TED Talk with supporting information, but it helps you think about how to look at the future and include some of the similar tenets to what we've already talked about with previous models, but in a different way. Another example, which is one that's been around for a very long time, is called the VIRO model. And this analysis just helps you look more at your consumer base, who your consumers could be, and other ways that you can address the different needs of changing markets in particular. So it's really about positioning companies to be more strategic in markets where they may not be as fortunate or may have a lot of competition to challenge. Another type of model in here is called theory of change. It picks up on some of the similar ideas we had elsewhere, but basically walks through a 6-stage model when you start to look at long-term goals and then find ways or the steps to reach those goals. Finally, you're going to find on the website some checklists that can help you begin this process, or at least begin to think about some of these ideas, and maybe even help you decide which tool is best for you. You know, you don't have to be perfect with this. It's really about trying to get a little bit of a framework to think about these issues. And any one of these will help you get going. And you know what? It's a lot of fun at the same time. Okay, now that was a good way to get started. I just wanted to get you thinking about your current context and challenges and introduce you to a little bit of the tools that are on the website. But now I want to pull up for a moment and look at strategic planning from a little bit of a broader context. So what are some of the classic steps or stages that one would go through? We actually just looked at one of those, and that was number 5 on this diagram, conducting a bit of an environmental analysis. You can see there were some financial, some work that you could have done in advance, like analyzing your financial situation, looking at what your needs or projections would be, looking at the kinds of issues or impacts you've had on your business, that the business has had, identifying some resources. Those would have been even prior to maybe even looking at an environmental scan. Now we've, again, got more information on the site for this, and you're welcome to go and download it. For example, analyzing financial scenarios, you're going to look at what's happened to your revenues, how you're managing your cash flow, and if you've got a liquidity risk, where you might have a need for refinancing or loans, what the impact is on your payroll and other staffing concerns. Now, this is all going to sound a little daunting as I say this, and indeed it can feel that way. But I want to assure you, this is part of a checklist, something that you'll find is a friendly tool that you can go to and fall back on, and just look at it as a step-by-step process where each item gives you a chance to reflect and look at the information. And you don't have to be perfect. You can at least get the things done that you're aware of and familiar with, or for which you have information, and it'll help you build a stronger plan, even if you don't do everything. When you get to emphasizing the needs, the second item on there is emphasizing needs of the customer or the consumer and the community. You might look at some of the things you need to consider, like crisis communications, or implementing of health guidelines, or helping define what a new consumer is. When you're looking at impacts, these are things like, will your products and services you offer still work? Or if there's a change in markets, do you need to make a change? What about your supply chain? Is it stable? Will you be able to get the goods that you need? What about your workforce policies and practices? Do they still fit today's context? That, by the way, is an example of where we get a lot of calls. Companies are really struggling with trying to work with current legal labor law legislation when some of those things are outdated and don't fit the current context. So These are things that are help you understand these issues as you walk through them. Now, moving forward, when you get to category 6 on this diagram, then you have to start thinking about developing different options or scenarios, focusing on priorities, starting to put a little more of a plan together. And then you may even find the need to consult with others. Those might be friends and family, or certainly I would suggest your colleagues and workers, but you may also need legal opinion or other supports. Finally, you'll develop a plan, get a budget, set a timeline around it, and be in a position to implement it. I skipped through this fairly quickly because I don't want this to be overly academic, but what I've referred to on this diagram is actually part of this checklist. It's a 3-page, very detailed, step-by-step, free downloadable checklist that you can adapt as you need. It also helps you refer to other supports on our website. Things like helping manage cash flow during recovery, or helping develop a change management plan for your company, or how to tap into new visitor markets, or how to improve on your inventory control system. These are all tenets that will help you address some very current chronic concerns that will help you stay afloat. Now, the idea of a checklist and why we've created them is because it's a simple reference for you. Essentially, it's a step-by-step guide, and these were put up so that you could download them, adapt them, edit them, change them, and there's references to other tools on the site to help you work through different points. Some of the topics in the webinar series are based on these checklists, based on what the market is asked for. Okay. Now, another example from the website looks at strategic planning from this lens, the strategic planning cycle. Now, this embodies many of the same ideas, but it also highlights an important item, that strategy planning is ongoing. A good business is always in the process of discovery and anticipating change. In many ways, a company must have a culture of change and be disciplined in looking at its practices routinely, doing things such as analyzing the markets, and ultimately adapting to new circumstances. Companies that have had to work through COVID issues who are good at strategic planning have mastered this cycle. It's part of their culture. If you're not doing some of these things, it really is something to think about carefully. A good tourism business is in the business of change. Without it, you probably would not survive. You might have been doing a lot of this, maybe not necessarily as formally as the diagram might suggest. The diagram, though, does help give you a little more guidance, as do the tools that are associated with it on the website, so that it helps you drill down into each of these. For example, here it talks about proposed mission. Well, the guidance on the site will tell you about what you might look at to help define a mission, or on goals, on how to write goals, and so on. Now, flipping gears for a little bit, let's just look at a few examples of how certain companies today, real life Canadian examples, on how they have mastered this idea of strategic planning and subsequently their nimbleness to do change. This first example was a real find. Ontario Tourism Innovation Lab caught our attention. This initiative really is smart. It's one of the only ones we found that does what they are doing here. Now, these examples will also be featured at the 2020 Ontario Summit, and you can see more information on the Tourism Industry Association of Ontario's website. And that website, by the way, is tiaontario.ca for more information. Now, one example that they feature is Terry Jenkins from TJ Stables. This was also featured in the Canadian press and picked up in a few articles in trade magazines and newspapers. Now, what TJ Staples is located in Chatham, Kent, which is basically the southern tip of Ontario. And much of Chatham, Kent faces Lake Erie. It's kind of lodged between the two big lakes there, two grand lakes. Now, this region is one of Canada's tourism destinations, as many of you would know. TJ Staples is, by their definition on their website, an award-winning recreational, fully accessible equine facility providing a fun and educational introduction to horseback riding, which lends to a lifetime relationship with horses. Farms and dogs go together like peanut butter and jelly. So in 2008, TJ Staples created a dog boarding facility where your pet vacations on the farm while you are away, is how they put it. Now, what this is telling us, though, just a point here, is that TJ Staples is far more than a stable. It's way beyond horseback riding. They've diversified significantly to do dog and pet boarding, to host special events such as birthday parties, programs for special riders. Those are people with different forms of disabilities. They have Saturday farm fun sessions, corporate events, school programs. And there's another important feature to note with what they're doing. They have a strong connection to the local Indigenous community. So as a company, their expansion has diversified what they do. They've tapped into new markets, and they're nimble enough to adjust to different changing circumstances. They're one reason why they're being featured as a star attraction. There are several others on the Innovation Lab worth noting. Please go check it out. Another example we've used for today is from Toronto's Culinary Adventure Company, which I found their little repositioned tagline, "Yes, we are still leading food tours, just in one box at a time," a refreshing comment here. What they're doing is picking up on what they've always done and remind people they're still in business, they're just doing it differently. Now, this company normally operates food tours to different neighborhoods. It created what is called food tours in a box. It's a curated selection of favorite treats and meals from different neighborhoods and partners, which they then deliver to your door. Now, there are many other examples that we identified. Our intent is to actually produce more information on these in some of our upcoming newsletters to give people an idea of ways of working differently. In a featured webinar coming up, there is actually the next webinar coming up is new revenue strategies. We will be able to pick up on these examples and more to show you how you can convert some of your current operations to target new markets and different strategies. So for today, I'm leaving it to these two examples, but I encourage you to come to our next webinar where this will be the primary focus. Now, I want to just wrap up a few key points here and get into some other information that will help you. So a few tips from those that have been there and done that. In other words, what is some best practices in managing strategic planning? Well, engage your team is one of the big ones. Ultimately, you're going to have to make sure that everyone in your business knows what decisions are made, who's responsible, what changes you want to make, why you're going to make them, set a plan. This basically involves everybody. Your information flow is essential, and people also may need to know how to understand information. It's not good enough to just disseminate it. So a key tip, engage your team. Get them involved in the planning. They are one of the few people that know your business inside and out and can help rally ideas and be enthusiastic about the direction and where it needs to go. It helps set a culture of how to work. Also, another tip, get a focus vision of change. Be clear on what you need to change and where you need to focus. Set priorities. With your plan, design something in steps that you know you can attain. Be flexible. So be realistic. Don't have to do it all, but do try to at least identify things that you know you can tackle and do it in an order that is flexible something that you feel comfortable with, set a path, and start. Work with the resources you have and reach out for other expertise you may not have. Not all of that means having to pay for it. You'll be surprised at how many people in your community want to help out, or how many resources are available online or through other means to help you. Another tip, engage your community. Tourism businesses are often the anchor to the community. They are the main economic driver. They're one of the main employers. To think about recovery and to help thrive and to engineer changes in what you're doing really is a community-led effort. Involving players from your community will help strengthen your own efforts as an individual company. There's lots of good, reliable information for you to access. Our site certainly is designed to do that through TourismRecovery.ca, but not only there. You'll also want to go to Destination Canada. Both of our sites have links to other information. It's all free. Get into the habit of knowing more about your markets, what's working, what's not, and chase the trends. Inform your business model and survival by constantly chasing the trends. Fundamentally, keep it positive. There's lots of room for optimism, and this actually can be a lot of fun. Bottom line, I always say to people, make it simple but significant. In other words, don't make this too daunting. Just chip away at it in a way that's comfortable for you, that's appropriate. At least you'll have a lot to work with, and you'll start to do things as you are able, and you'll do more as you succeed. Let's wrap up with a few key messages. Today's webinar was an introduction to strategic planning to help struggling businesses look at how it can respond to the crisis we face today. COVID has decimated the sector, and we know we're in it for the long run. This means we need to adapt and adopt a culture of change. To summarize, I want to reinforce the benefits of strategic planning, the why we need to do this, especially in times of uncertainty. Strategic planning is going to help strengthen the ownership. In other words, your team are going to have a stronger commitment to change. It's going to give you a clear pathway, one with a focused direction, one with to help you be more nimble and flexible in order to achieve your goals. Inherent in strategic planning is the engagement of the stakeholders that are impacted and those that you intend to serve. This helps you build a stronger community, commitment, and some level of authority to proceed so that people are behind you. It creates a common objective or goal. It helps everyone rally behind a common course of action. Important here is it informs your future training, your development, your investments in infrastructure, and finally, it's going to help you gain further efficiencies and nimbleness or flexibility. Of course, there are other benefits, but this gives you a good snapshot on why it's worthwhile. In fact, I suggest that at the heart of any strong tourism business is the need to be a good strategic planner. Business, after all, is dependent on your ability to think creatively, to think differently, to be nimble, to adjust. And that effectively is what defines tourism. Finally, a few things I don't want to lose sight of before I go so you know where to find more information. Our website has a lot of tools for you to work with. There is much more available at TourismRecovery.ca, particularly in response to challenges as a result of COVID. There is the COVID tab, which many of you are familiar with, which is an up-to-date resource on tools to access. It's curated, it's specific to workforce issues. Under the labor market information tab, I pulled it down on purpose. There's lots of different data points in there. The one that people are gravitated to in a big way is the employment tracker. Here, there's interactive charts you can use to extract data specific to your region or sector or type of business. Gives you some idea of the impacts, projections, impacts on revenues, projections on revenues, and so on. And underneath our news tab, of course, is where we have our blog and, really importantly, our information available through Tourism HR Insider, our newsletter that is published every second Wednesday. A little shout out here to Heather, who is our editor of this. She does an amazing job, and I think if you are not subscribed to this, you're missing out. You most certainly want to receive this newsletter. It does provide some of the most current information, and in it, we feature examples of the kinds of things you've seen today. Finally, we've been talking about it all along, but in the end, the main place to go is TourismRecovery.ca. Here, we've amassed a large number of tools, and this site is meant to be one that is evergreen. In other words, we are adding to it, we are updating it. New tools and different services will be added based on demand. The webinar series is one of those examples. There are downloadable tools. There are links to a number of resource sites. We're looking forward to an upgrade as well, where we're going to be producing some instructional material on business development issues coming in the near future. The site is intended to be very friendly. As I said, one of the major features that people gravitate towards are the downloadable checklists. Finally, this is one of many webinar series. For 2020, it is our first one we've delivered as part of the Tourism Recovery series. Upcoming one, the next one is October 28th, and 2 weeks from now, on new revenue strategies. Here, the focus will be looking at actual examples of how companies have transformed, what they are doing. And with those examples, we're also going to give you some guidance on how you might too think about how you can transform some of your operations to start providing different kinds of programs and services. As we move along, we'll be adding additional webinars based on demand. On behalf of the Board of Directors, I want to thank everyone for attending today. Don't hesitate to reach out to any of us. We're always here to help. We welcome your input and your guidance. Tourism HR Canada is intended to be responsive to your needs. If this webinar or other types of webinars of this type will be of help to you, we'd love to hear from you. Strategic Planning for Tourism Business Continuity was today's webinar. For more information, please go to tourismhr.ca. The downloadable presentation will be there. We wish you and your family good health during these uncertain and unprecedented times. Thank you, everyone.